The sky belonged to the Allies, a relentless steel canopy of heavy bombers raining fire upon the surface of Europe. To survive this aerial annihilation, the military command of the Third Reich made a desperate and terrifying engineering decision. They would take their most advanced, highly classified industrial war machine and bury it alive. They would carve out the very core of a solid limestone mountain and construct a sprawling mechanical underworld where the sun never shines. This was not just a defensive bunker, it was Mittelwerk, the largest subterranean factory in human history, an abyssal labyrinth of darkness designed to mass-produce the ultimate weapon of the future, the V-2 ballistic missile. Right now, you are going to witness how the world's first space-capable rocket was forged in the deepest depths of a subterranean hell, and how the mass-production philosophy of the civilian automotive industry was weaponized to absolute, devastating extremes. In the late summer of 1943, a devastating Allied bombing raid on the Peenemünde research facility completely shattered the German illusion of surface invulnerability. Their cutting-edge rocket program was left in burning ruins. The strategic directive from the High Command was immediate and absolute. Relocate the entire aerospace manufacturing apparatus beneath the Earth, placing it permanently out of reach of any radar system and every conventional bomb. The chosen location was the Kohnstein mountain, a massive, imposing geological formation in central Germany. To carve out this subterranean empire, industrial engineers detonated millions of tons of high-explosive charges deep inside the ancient bedrock. The sheer physical scale of the excavation process was mathematically staggering. Over 20 kilometers of usable industrial floor space was hollowed out from the solid stone, creating a cavernous, pitch-black void that could easily swallow entire freight train convoys without a trace. At the structural core of this engineering anomaly was a highly calculated, ruthlessly efficient geometric layout. The architects of Mittelwerk did not just blindly dig tunnels into the rock. They engineered a colossal, interconnected underground ladder of steel and stone. The entire facility was defined by two primary parallel arterial shafts, clinically designated as Tunnel A and Tunnel B. These twin caverns were massive engineering marvels in their own right, stretching nearly 2 kilometers in length, with rough-hewn rock ceilings arching high enough to accommodate heavy industrial overhead cranes. Tunnel A served as the primary logistical spine of the operation. It was a dedicated subterranean railway line, where heavily armored freight trains constantly rumbled into the darkness, delivering raw steel plates, highly volatile explosive warheads, and highly corrosive liquid fuel directly into the belly of the mountain. Parallel to this logistical artery lay Tunnel B, the absolute mechanical nightmare itself. This was the final assembly line, the brutal industrial heart where the massive 12-ton V-2 rockets were systematically pieced together. Connecting these two main longitudinal arteries were 46 perpendicular cross-galleries, forming the rungs of this giant underground ladder. Each of these cross-connecting tunnels served as a highly specialized mechanical bay. Some housed massive hydraulic presses that stamped out the aerodynamic outer shells with crushing force. Others were dedicated welding stations where showers of bright, blinding sparks constantly illuminated the suffocating darkness as technicians fused heavy alloy plates together. However, forcing a highly sensitive, high-tech aerospace assembly line into a natural, damp cave system immediately triggered a brutal environmental and physical conflict. Operating hundreds of meters below the surface of the Earth, the atmosphere inside the Mittelwerk complex was a highly toxic, unbreathable mixture of stagnant subterranean air, lethal abrasive limestone dust, and the suffocating, heavy exhaust fumes of diesel railway locomotives. There was absolutely no natural ventilation. The deafening, relentless roar of heavy pneumatic drills and the rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of industrial hydraulic hammers echoed endlessly off the jagged stone walls, creating an inescapable acoustic torture chamber for anyone trapped inside. The fine limestone dust infiltrated every microscopic crevice. It coated the heavy machinery, the electrical grids, and the highly delicate, perfectly machined rocket components in a thick, abrasive gray film that constantly threatened to seize up the entire mechanical operation. To force production forward in this subterranean purgatory, the management brought in the ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency of the mass automotive industry. The brilliant, but morally bankrupt masterminds behind the Volkswagen civilian assembly lines were explicitly tasked with applying their streamlined mass production philosophy to a weapon of mass destruction. They had to standardize a totally chaotic, hostile environment. They meticulously broke down the highly complex, scientifically demanding assembly of a supersonic ballistic missile into a rigid series of repetitive, relentless mechanical tasks. Under this system, the human element was entirely stripped of its humanity and reduced to a mere mechanical variable. Tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were funneled deep into the mountain, treated not as human workers, but as completely expendable biological fuel designed to keep the massive gears of production turning. They were literally worked to death in the darkness, their bodies physically breaking down under the crushing weight of cold steel, the toxic atmospheric pressure, and the complete absence of sunlight, all while the relentless, roaring assembly line continued its unstoppable mechanical march forward, producing the missiles that would soon rain fire from the stratosphere. The sheer logistical nightmare of moving components weighing several tons through the narrow, unpaved secondary tunnels required a brutal combination of human muscle and primitive winches. The massive combustion chambers of the V-2 rockets, designed to withstand temperatures of 2,700 degrees Celsius, had to be carefully maneuvered through the dark, dust-choked corridors. Every single steel bolt tightened, every rivet driven into the rocket's skin, was done under the constant, terrifying threat of structural cave-ins and the suffocating heat generated by thousands of bodies and roaring machines confined in a sealed rock tomb. This was not merely a factory, it was a physical manifestation of industrial desperation, a place where the laws of thermodynamics, structural engineering, and human endurance were pushed far beyond their absolute breaking points to serve a failing war machine. How do you fuse thousands of aerodynamic alloy plates and calibrate the most hypersensitive gyroscopic guidance system in the world inside a constantly dripping, completely saturated limestone cave? This was the ultimate physical contradiction of the Mittelwerk facility. The subterranean environment itself was actively, aggressively hostile to the extreme microscopic precision required for advanced aerospace engineering. Look up at the jagged, uneven ceiling of Tunnel B. Anchored directly into the raw, unstable bedrock were massive, heavy-duty industrial overhead cranes. These mechanical behemoths traversed the entire length of the cavern on heavy steel rails, effortlessly lifting immense, multi-ton combustion chambers and massive liquid oxygen tanks through the choking, abrasive dust. Beneath them, an endless, terrifyingly efficient assembly line crawled forward. Giant hydraulic presses, exerting hundreds of tons of localized kinetic pressure, stamped out the thin, aerodynamic outer steel shells designed to encase the 12-ton rocket. The sheer mechanical violence of these immense presses shook the very foundations of the mountain, creating a relentless, rhythmic earthquake that never ceased. Every single stamping operation required absolute metallurgical precision. If the steel casing was warped by even a fraction of a millimeter, the intense aerodynamic friction generated at Mach 4 would inevitably tear the entire missile apart in mid-air. The dedicated welding stations were equally nightmarish. Showers of blinding, superheated blue sparks rained down continuously as technicians fused the heavy structural ribs of the rocket's inner fuselage. Because the ambient oxygen levels were dangerously low in these unventilated depths, the heavy-duty welding torches frequently choked out, and the resulting metallurgical bonds were often structurally compromised, plagued by microscopic stress fractures that would only catastrophically reveal themselves under the immense dynamic load of a supersonic launch. Further down this brutal line, the highly volatile hydrogen peroxide jet turbine fuel pumps were painstakingly assembled. These specific components were essentially highly pressurized, unpredictable bombs waiting to detonate if their internal mechanisms were contaminated by a single speck of dirt. Yet, they were being pieced together in an environment where thick, abrasive rock dust coated absolutely everything. But the dust, as dangerous as it was only the secondary threat. The absolute fatal flaw, the catastrophic physical vulnerability of this entire subterranean empire was water. The internal climate of the Kohnstein mountain maintained a constant, inescapable humidity level hovering between 90 and 100%. The air itself was practically liquid. Freezing, mineral-rich condensation gathered heavily on the cold rock ceilings and constantly dripped down like a toxic, corrosive rain onto the exposed assembly lines below. For the heavy steel structural components, this constant moisture caused rapid, aggressive rusting. But for the critical brain of the V-2 rocket, this dripping water was an absolute, immediate death sentence. The V-2 did not rely on modern digital electronics. Its trajectory was strictly guided by a highly complex, phenomenally sensitive mechanical analog computer and the LEV-3 double gyroscope system. These internal navigation units were pure mechanical miracles. They consisted of hyper-precise rotating brass wheels spinning at incredible RPMs, delicate electrical relays, and incredibly fine silver wiring that had to mathematically measure the rocket's pitch, yaw, and roll at terrifying supersonic speeds. The gyroscopes were suspended in complex, frictionless gimbal frames, relying on absolute physical isolation to maintain a fixed point of reference against the rotation of the Earth, while the rocket violently accelerated upward. A single drop of mineral-rich limestone condensation hitting these exposed circuits would instantly cause a catastrophic electrical short circuit. A microscopic layer of moisture-induced corrosion on the gyroscopic gimbals would introduce a fractional mechanical drag, completely throwing the missile's automated trajectory off by dozens of miles. The mountain was effectively destroying the rockets from the inside out before they even left the assembly line. To counter this devastating physical reality, the desperate engineers were forced to implement a completely insane mechanical solution. Deep inside this filthy, toxic, actively dripping cavern, they constructed highly isolated, hermetically sealed clean rooms. These were essentially high-tech enclosed bunkers within the dark bunker, completely walled off from the horrific atmosphere of Tunnel B. To keep the aggressive moisture out, they installed massive, heavy-duty forced industrial dehumidification and ventilation systems. These giant thermodynamic air scrubbers roared violently 24 hours a day, consuming vast amounts of electrical power. They utilized heavy chemical desiccants and rapid thermodynamic temperature cycling to aggressively suck the moisture out of the enclosed atmosphere, creating a fragile, entirely artificial microclimate where the delicate gyroscopes could be safely calibrated. It was a surreal, jarring juxtaposition of brutal, heavy industry and delicate, surgical precision, all buried hundreds of meters underground. The operational tempo inside this mechanical underworld was nothing short of a frantic, industrialized frenzy. The assembly line was a living, breathing mechanical monster that demanded constant feeding, operating on a ruthless, continuous shift system where the massive steel conveyor chains never stopped moving for a single second. The noise was a physical, oppressive entity, a crushing weight of mechanical sound that caused permanent auditory damage. The thunderous, repetitive slam of the hydraulic presses echoed like heavy artillery fire. The blinding flashes of arc welding continuously illuminated the thick, suffocating dust clouds, casting long, demonic shadows against the wet cave walls. Despite the catastrophic environmental conditions, despite the rapidly collapsing biological workforce, and despite the inherent physical instability of the experimental rocket design itself, the massive gears of Mittelwerk were violently overclocked by the high command. The production targets were absolute, unforgiving, and completely merciless. Through a terrifying combination of sheer mechanical force, extreme thermodynamic engineering, and unfathomable human suffering, this subterranean factory achieved a horrifying, unprecedented industrial output. At the absolute peak of its operational capacity, the Mittelwerk assembly matrix was violently ejecting 30 fully assembled, combat-ready V-2 ballistic missiles out of the mountain every single day. 30 hypersonic vectors of destruction, forged in absolute darkness, ready to be unleashed upon the world above. It is the ultimate, horrifying irony of human technological evolution. The very first man-made machine, designed to physically pierce the Earth's atmosphere and touch the absolute freezing edge of outer space, was not born in a pristine, sunlit laboratory. It was violently birthed from the deepest, darkest, and most suffocatingly toxic mechanical abyss on the planet. Once the brutal subterranean assembly line of Mittelwerk finally finished its relentless mechanical cycle, the terrifying end product had to be brought up to the surface. The logistics of moving a fully fueled 12-ton ballistic missile out of a subterranean limestone tomb required a highly specialized and incredibly dangerous transportation network. The final stretch of Tunnel B seamlessly transitioned into what was effectively a subterranean logistical nightmare. The completed V-2 rockets, painted in their sinister, disruptive camouflage patterns, were horizontally loaded onto heavy-duty reinforced railway flat cars. This was the beginning of the Railway of Death. The armored freight trains, belching thick black diesel smoke into the already toxic cave atmosphere, slowly dragged these horizontal pillars of destruction out of the mountain's core and into the blinding daylight. But a static launch pad was a guaranteed death sentence. The Allied aerial reconnaissance planes, equipped with high-resolution stereoscopic cameras, dominated the skies above Europe. Any permanent concrete launch facility would be immediately identified and utterly obliterated by heavy bombers within 24 hours. To solve this critical tactical vulnerability, the engineers developed a completely revolutionary concept, the highly mobile, hydraulic launch system known as the Mittelwerk. As soon as the V-2 rockets exited the mountain on the railway cars, they were heavily camouflaged and quickly transferred onto these specialized, multi-wheeled transporter-erector vehicles. The Mittelwerk was a mechanical beast in its own right, equipped with massive, heavy-duty hydraulic pistons designed to lift the 12-ton rocket from a horizontal transport position to a perfectly vertical launch alignment in a matter of minutes. The tactical doctrine was ruthless and highly effective. A convoy of these Mittelwerks, accompanied by specialized liquid oxygen tanker trucks and heavily armored command vehicles, would silently roll into the dense, snow-covered forests of Western Europe under the absolute cover of darkness. They required no concrete bunkers, no permanent infrastructure, just a small clearing in the woods. The entire launch sequence, from erecting the missile, rapidly pumping in the highly volatile freezing liquid oxygen and explosive alcohol fuel, to the final gyroscopic calibration, was violently compressed into a frantic 90-minute window. They would initiate the launch sequence, send the weapon roaring into the stratosphere, and completely evacuate the clearing long before the Allied radar could even attempt to trace the trajectory back to its source. However, the desperate, violent mass production inside the Kohnstein mountain ultimately doomed the weapon's physical reliability. As the massive Allied armies closed in on Germany from all sides, the High Command issued fanatical, completely irrational orders to drastically accelerate the Mittelwerk production lines. They demanded sheer numbers, completely ignoring the absolute limits of physical engineering and basic metallurgical science. The massive hydraulic presses were overclocked beyond their structural tolerances. The delicate gyroscopes were hurriedly calibrated in highly compromised, moisture-contaminated clean rooms. The exhausted biological workforce could no longer maintain the microscopic precision required for advanced aerospace assembly. This reckless industrial desperation resulted in a catastrophic, cascading series of fatal mechanical flaws. The extreme humidity of the subterranean cave had already done its silent, invisible damage. Micro-corrosion on the silver wiring of the LEV-3 guidance systems caused them to violently short-circuit mid-flight. Critical welding seams on the superheated combustion chambers, compromised by the toxic dust and lack of oxygen in the tunnels, instantly ruptured under the terrifying pressure of a Mach 4 atmospheric re-entry. A staggering percentage of the V-2 rockets produced in the final months were essentially highly complex, 12-ton mechanical duds. Many violently exploded right on the mobile Mittelwerk launch pads, creating massive, devastating fireballs of burning liquid alcohol that instantly incinerated the launch crews. Others lost their gyroscopic mines high in the stratosphere, tumbling wildly out of control and crashing harmlessly into empty fields, miles away from their intended targets. The weapon designed to win the war was physically destroying itself from the inside out, a direct consequence of the brutal, incompatible environment in which it was forged. When the war finally collapsed, the true, horrifying scale of this subterranean engineering empire was exposed to the world. American combat engineers and specialized scientific intelligence units, operating under the highly classified Operation Paperclip, were the first to penetrate the dark tunnels of Mittelwerk. As they descended into the massive, echoing caverns, their flashlights illuminated a scene of absolute industrial madness. They found miles upon miles of highly advanced assembly lines, massive overhead cranes hanging silently in the damp darkness, and hundreds of partially assembled V-2 rockets left abandoned on the heavy steel railway cars. The sheer mathematical scale of the excavation, the terrifying application of mass automotive production lines to aerospace ballistics, and the dark reality of the subterranean environment left the Allied scientists in absolute shock. But they did not destroy this mechanical underworld. They meticulously documented it. They captured the intact rockets, the hydraulic presses, the classified technical blueprints, and most importantly, the lead engineers who designed this system. The Soviet military intelligence units arrived shortly after, aggressively tearing out whatever heavy machinery and technical data the Americans had left behind, sparking the beginning of a new technological Cold War. This dark, damp limestone cave in central Germany was not just a graveyard for a failed war machine, it was the absolute, undeniable genesis of the modern space age. The highly complex aerodynamic principles, the regenerative liquid cooling systems, and the mechanical gyroscopic navigation units that were violently forced into existence inside Mittelwerk did not die with the Third Reich. They were directly absorbed, reverse-engineered, and aggressively perfected by the superpowers during the Cold War. The exact same brilliant, morally compromised engineering minds who oversaw this subterranean factory would go on to design the massive Saturn V rocket that eventually carried humanity to the surface of the Moon. The towering rockets that now launch satellites into orbit and explore the furthest reaches of our solar system all share a direct, undeniable mechanical lineage with the 12-ton weapons forged in the pitch-black, suffocating depths of the Kohnstein mountain. The greatest triumph of human space exploration was built directly upon the darkest, most terrifying foundation of industrial engineering ever constructed. If you want to uncover more horrifying engineering secrets and the massive, billion-dollar machines that have secretly shaped human history, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling us which classified megastructure we should aggressively deconstruct in the next video. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop looking beneath the surface.